Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on setting a science-based target for the retail and manufacturing sector. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end or afterwards via email. I would now like to introduce today's first presenter, Steve Kenzie from the UN Global Compact Network UK.
Thanks very much, Maddie. Welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm joined by, next slide please, Pauline Optebeek from Carbon Trust, and obviously myself, Joe Hulme from the Co-op Group, and Eoin White from CDP. And we're very much looking forward to speaking with you today about raising your ambition for a 1.5 degree science-based target. To start, I'm just going to tell you a few words about the UN Global Compact. It's the largest corporate sustainability initiative in the world, led by the UN. We are based around 10 universal principles that are drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor standards, environment, anti-corruption. And it's a global movement with 10,000 companies participating and 68 country networks around the world. Our network here in the UK, our mission is to turn that global momentum on sustainability into practical local action. We work across the UK with UN Global Compact participants and other partners to inspire business ambition to deliver on the global goals, to enable practical action, and to shape a responsible business environment. We offer a wide range of engagement opportunities through 3 work streams: global goals, business and human rights, and climate action. On climate action, we support our members' compliance with TCFD, and today's theme on setting science-based targets for emissions reductions, we support the UNGC's business ambition for 1.5 campaign, and of course we're gearing up, as presumably all of you are, for COP26. Next slide, please. This webinar is part of a series of 6, the very last one, that we've been doing in collaboration with Carbon Trust to support companies in setting science-based targets. And clearly, this isn't, you're not going to walk away from this session ready to go back to your desk and set a science-based target, but we hope we will help get you thinking, give you some key ideas to set you on this pathway, to convince perhaps others in your organization of the importance of taking this approach. Next slide, please. And to further reinforce that, the business ambition for 1.5 campaign that's sponsored by UNGC, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and We Mean Business, is a really key platform that we welcome you to become a part of. It's critical as we move towards net zero targets here in the UK and abroad, that we do so along a 1.5 degree science-based pathway. A net zero target for 2050 is really meaningless without that deeper commitment. And so we really are hoping that we're going to inspire you today to get on board with this initiative. Next. So maybe just going to reiterate that. We're going to go through some of the specific aspects of setting science-based targets within the retail and manufacturing sectors. We're going to talk about the implications around Scope 3 and science-based targets, the challenges and opportunities of science-based targets, and some practical tips on how to get started. If you have any questions, please use the chat function. There's the questions box, keeping my webinar platform straight. We'll be keeping an eye on that, and there is a Q&A at the end, and we will do our very best to get to those questions. And of course, if we don't answer your question during the webinar, we will be following up with you afterwards to make sure that your questions are answered. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Pauline, and thank you again for joining us and for your attention. Have a great day.
Thank you, Steve. So for those of you who perhaps are not familiar with the Carbon Trust, I thought I'd give a brief overview. So we're a mission-driven consultancy based in London with offices across the world, and our mission is to accelerate the move to a sustainable low-carbon economy. And as you can see, we have very much a global presence. We're growing year on year, and we really do have nearly 20 years of experience. So we do know what does work and what doesn't, and that's working with corporates such as those who have joined today, but also with governments and public bodies to really drive the acceleration to that low carbon economy from all aspects of society. So when it comes to science-based targets, we've worked with over 85 companies to help them set targets that are aligned with science. And that actually represents 10% of all companies that have had their targets validated by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And as you can see, this kind of ranges across a broad view of all sectors. And when it comes to the retail and manufacturing sector, as it relates to science-based targets, scope 3, but also kind of product-related work or assurance work, we really do have a broad overview of this sector, working with international as well as UK-based clients across the retail and manufacturing sectors. So I thought we could start with a bit of background to science-based targets, and that obviously begins with climate change. So as you can see from this graph, global warming is happening today, and we are already at 1 degree higher than the pre-industrial levels. So what this looks like, we have already this 1 degree, which, as I'm sure many of you have noticed in the past few years, has resulted in some more extreme weather events. This is likely to increase. Hopefully we can keep things to 1.52 degrees, but as you can see from this little chart, the higher we go, the more environmental impacts, which obviously translate into social as well as economic impacts. And at that point, everyone will be touched by this. So the hope is obviously to avoid as many environmental impacts as possible by limiting global warming to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees. So the context for science-based targets. So all of this culminated obviously in the Paris Agreement in 2015, where all of the nations of the world agreed at that time to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit this to 1.5 degrees. And the IPCC came out with an updated pathway report on limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees in October of 2018, noting that in fact keeping global warming to well below 2 degrees might actually not be enough, and we really do need to ramp up the ambition to keeping it below 1.5 degree. And this is an ongoing piece of work to really understand what that looks like from a national as well as a corporate perspective. So when it comes to the Paris Agreement, you can see here the grey bar is what would happen if no one did anything, which we obviously want to avoid. Then if you look at the dark blue bar, that is what countries have committed to. So this is national governments committing to reduce their emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. But as you can see, that really only limits global warming to 3 degrees or even 3.5 degrees, which is well above what scientists have deemed we should limit it to. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative really comes out of the recognition that governments can only go so far, and the private sector really does have a big role to play to help fill that gap and to supplant the efforts that their national governments are putting in place. And we have seen over the years that the ambition for science-based targets has increased. Companies are joining and committing every day. And a recent survey conducted by the SBTI showed that overwhelmingly setting science-based targets strengthens your brand reputation, it helps to drive innovation, gives you a competitive advantage, boosts investor confidence, and also increasingly is helping companies become resilient against upcoming regulation. And while that's the lowest point for now, I think that reason is probably due to increase in the next few years as companies strengthen their commitment to the Paris Agreement and start to translate some of those commitments into regulation. So I'll now hand it over to our colleagues at the SBTI to tell us a bit more about the Science-Based Targets Initiative.
Thank you very much. So I can give a quick introduction to the SBTI and the role that we play in actually promoting, developing, and indeed validating science-based targets. So the initiative is composed of 4 international organizations: CDP, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And our role primarily is to, first of all, essentially translate the global science that we receive from the likes of the IPCC into specific corporate pathways that allows companies to actually set targets. So our first step is essentially to develop the core foundational methodologies, and we do this through our criteria, our guidance, and our sector development work. So in the past has included developing our sector decarbonisation approach, in addition to specific guidance for various sectors, and also then updating our resources in line with the latest climate science. So just in the last couple of years, we have updated that to include 1.5 degree pathways for companies, and we intend to keep that going as climate science develops. Our methods will, of course, keep being updated as well. The second major function of the SBTI is the promotion of SBTs. So we have a very active engagement where we work directly with companies and particular sectors to promote the adoption of SBTs by companies, to try to remove the barriers for SBT adoption, in principle by trying to kind of simplify the understanding of what an SBT actually is and how companies can actually go about setting those targets. And then finally, our other role is on the validation of the targets. So the SBTI also acts as kind of an independent validator for company submissions. So companies will submit their targets to the SBTI. They are reviewed by a team of experts, and then they're peer reviewed by our partner organizations to ensure that the assumptions going into those targets, the underlying emissions data, and the target ambition is all aligned with the climate science. And then the SBTI will classify those targets against long-term temperature goals. So at the moment, our minimum ambition requirements are for companies to be aligned with a well below 2 degree pathway. So we assess if those company submissions are indeed aligned with this ambition. And of course, we always promote companies to have a higher level of ambition and be aligned with the 1.5 degree pathway. So these kind of science-based targets have been underway for the past 5 years or so. So we're coming up to actually our 5th anniversary. And you can see from the graph here, from a relatively slow start in the first couple of years, the adoption over the last 2 years has dramatically increased. And I think this is down to a combination of just general awareness, but also the ecosystem has developed rapidly. So the companies, the consultancies, and indeed also the SBTI guidance has all become much clearer. I think companies now are much more aware of the expectations among them. The barriers to setting targets have been reduced significantly. We also now operate a target validation service, which allows companies to submit their targets and receive decisions within 30 business days. So it's a much more rapid process than it was in previous years. That also helps to reduce the barriers to adoption. So that's all kind of for me on an introduction, but happy to take any questions later on.
Fantastic, thank you. So to add a bit more flavor to this graph and what it means to the retail and manufacturing sectors, I just thought I'd take a little snapshot of how many companies in both sectors have committed to setting science-based targets. So this is a public commitment that they will be setting those targets, and then also the amount of approved targets. Obviously, manufacturing does kind of range across a very broad amount of sectors, and we can see that more manufacturing clients have set this, but retail is really coming in strong, and there's a few kind of logos of some of the companies globally that have set targets in those sectors, some of which we have worked with, and of course the co-op will be speaking later on in this webinar about their experience. So one of the key elements of setting a scope 1 and 2 target and scope 3 targets for science-based targets is that you do have to do all 3 in the retail and manufacturing sector. And that's because in these sectors, we know that well over the majority of your total emissions are going to lie within your scope 3. And the SBTI says that if that makes over 40% of your total emissions profile, you do have to include scope 3 within your science-based target. So we know that for retail and manufacturing clients, the key hotspots within that scope 3 are going to be the purchased goods and services, potentially transportation and distribution, depending on your business model, and of course the use of sold products, which again will vary on the types of products that you're producing and selling. So it's very important that when you do come to calculate your scope 3 to spend, perhaps more time on these categories, given that that's likely what is going to make up the majority of your target. So what that looks like in terms of actual requirements, if we look at scope 1 and 2 first, you have to include all of your scope 1 and 2, and this target should cover a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 15 years from the date which the target is submitted. And as was previously stated, the minimum ambition is well below 2 degrees, and obviously the more companies that set a 1.5 degree target, the better, given that that really pushes that maximum level of ambition. And in order to achieve that, you're likely to potentially move to renewable electricity, obviously to pursue more energy efficiency projects, but unfortunately the use of offsets is not counted within this. So it really does have to be actual reductions in your scope 1 and 2 footprint. Offsets are obviously something that you might pursue as part of a different strategy, but they're not counted towards achieving your scope 1 and 2 targets. Then when it comes to scope 3 targets, as I mentioned before, if your scope 3 is more than 40% of the total, you do have to pursue a scope 3 target, and that must cover at least 2/3 of your scope 3 emissions. So going back to the previous slide, that is likely to cover the products, purchased goods and services, as well as the transportation elements of your scope 3, and recognizing that these elements are quite a bit more challenging to kind of intervene in and reduce, the SBTI does allow these targets to be aligned with a well below kind of 2 degree pathway. It's quite rare that companies pursue a 1.5 degree pathway, because that's a very aggressive decarbonization approach to elements of your supply chain that you perhaps do not have as much control over. Although, of course, if this is something that you can pursue, all the better. And the way that you set these targets is slightly different. So they can be absolute, they can be based on an economic or a physical intensity to allow for kind of, to be reflected by the amount of sales you do, for example. And also you can set targets for your suppliers to set their own science-based targets. So this would mean that you would have to engage the amount of suppliers that represent 60% of your total scope 3 emissions. So that might be thousands of suppliers, depending on your business model, but it might be a more manageable amount, like 50 key suppliers, and they would then have to set their own science-based targets within the next 5 years. So this is an interesting approach to really help cascade science-based targets up your supply chain. But of course, many companies also set these kinds of absolute targets, which will involve product innovations, material innovations to get to that level of reduction. And one of the key updates recently is that the SBTI has developed some guidance for SMEs. So this is applicable to any company with less than 500 employees, and it's a more streamlined approach to setting science-based targets. So there's essentially 2 options. You can set a 1.5 degree target, which is a 50% reduction by 2030 against a baseline of 2018. So you can obviously break that down into what it looks like on an annual basis. And then the well below 2 degree target is a 30% reduction by 2030. And again, the use of offsets is not counted towards that. And in the scope 3 element, you do not have to set a target, but you do have to commit to measure and reduce your scope 3 emissions. So it's a bit more flexible on that end, recognizing that SMEs have, a smaller purchasing power than some of the larger corporates that are setting scope 3 targets. But of course, recognizing that each company has a role to play in influencing the emissions associated with its products and services through engaging its supply chain partners. So when it comes to how does one actually calculate a science-based target, essentially there is a global carbon budget that has been assessed that we have left in order to maintain global warming to a well below 2 degree or 1.5 degree scenario. And then it's a question of assessing, okay, what is my portion of that remaining budget by 2030, by 2050, and what is the difference between my allowance and what I am totally emitting? And that is how you would calculate that reduction. There are, of course, a few different methodologies that you can take to calculate this. But essentially what we are mainly talking about today is obviously this 1.5 degree level of ambition, which is currently considered best practice. So I mentioned these different methodologies. So currently the sectoral decarbonisation approach, so this is where you would set a decarbonisation pathway in line with your sector, is only available for well below 2 degrees. And that kind of picks off what I mentioned earlier, that the IPCC report on which this methodology is based is still under development as it relates to sectoral movements towards a 1.5 degrees. So this sectoral decarbonisation approach is currently only available for a well below 2 degree, but essentially it assesses, depending on the carbon intensity of the sector and the relative ease with which it can currently decarbonize with today's available technologies, it assesses the different pathways that those sectors have to take. Then you have the absolute contraction approach, which is essentially the same reduction pathway for all companies within a given time frame. And this exists for well below 2 degrees, which is 2.5% year on year, or 1.5 degrees, which is 4.2% year on year. So this is essentially an average and will be the same for all companies regardless of sector. So just a little overview of the sectoral decarbonisation approach. So this comes from the IPCC report, which has essentially looked at the different budgets that each sector should have and what their relative contribution is to global warming and what their budgets are up until 2050 and the pathways that they have to follow. So essentially you can look into what sector you sit in and then take that pathway as your own pathway. How this relates for the organizations we have on the webinar today. So there aren't that many SDAs. What we do have is the service building sector. So this would be very applicable to the retail sector. It's essentially defined as buildings that provide a service. So this would be your offices, your retail spaces, your warehouses. But this does not apply for manufacturing sites. So while a manufacturing company could split its target into service buildings, it would only be applicable for your offices. However, what might be applicable for some of our manufacturing companies who have joined today, if you do have a large kind of freight element to your own operations, you can set a partial SDA to reflect that if that is a very big part of your business. So what's good about this approach is that it does allow you to kind of mix and match according to the main elements of your business. But as I said, there's no kind of specific SDA for your manufacturing operations themselves. So that would have to take an absolute contraction approach. So I appreciate that's a little bit complicated, but happy to ask kind of any specific questions you have on this towards the end. It was really just to kind of introduce that these different methodologies are available. Then we have the absolute contraction method. So the way that this was calculated was looking at all of the kind of scientific approaches to reaching this reduction. It then filtered whether it's a well below 2 degree or a 1.5 degree. The second filter is to make sure that emissions budgets are not exceeded. The third filter was then to make sure that emissions peak within 2020 and 2025. And then it filtered out any climate scenarios that lack credibility. And then that is how we got to this kind of 4.2%. So it essentially looks at all of the science that has looked at this kind of decarbonisation pathway, and 4.2% is the average that has come out as being the most reliable and suitable for companies to follow a 1.5 degree trajectory. So one of the key considerations, which I alluded to earlier, is the importance of scope 3. So as you can see from this little graphic here, which comes from the CDP supply chain report in 2018, certainly for retail and then as well for manufacturing, the ratio of supply chain to direct emissions is very substantial. So when it comes to setting your science-based target, the scope 1 and 2 in terms of achieving and setting the target is relatively easier. Of course, there are lots of decisions that have to be made internally and investments made. But when it comes to really kind of understanding what your scope 3 footprint is and the target you might set in that area, this is really going to be the bulk of your activities. And purchased goods and services within that is likely to be the target setting focus. Then, of course, given that many of you will be producing or selling products that your customers will use, whether it's washing clothes, heating up food, using electronics, that use phase element is going to be quite a big portion of your Scope 3 footprint. So there's different kinds of use phases. Indirect use phase is not eligible for targets. So that's, for example, when you are washing clothing, you have not manufactured the washing machine, you have sold the clothing. So while you should definitely calculate that, because it's completely out of your control, the efficiency of that washing machine, that is not included in a target for a clothing retailer, for example. However, if you are a manufacturer of washing machines, the direct use phase of that washing machine is considered within the eligibility of targets, because you as a manufacturer can influence the relative energy efficiency of that product and influence how your customers use it and how much energy they use. So those are, I guess, the key differences between those two elements, and considering whether or not you will have to include them within your Scope 3 footprint and potentially submitting it as part of your target. So that's enough from me about the background. I'll now hand it over to Joe, the Group Climate Change Officer at the Co-op, who we worked with to help them calculate their Scope 3 and set their science-based targets, and handing it over to you to tell us a bit more about your experience in delivering this work.
Thank you, Pauline, and good morning, everybody. Hello, I'm Joe. I'm Group Climate Change Officer for the Co-op. Pauline says I look after climate strategy, climate accounting, climate reporting. So, small brief, we are a mutual, a consumer cooperative with around a £10 billion turnover, thousands of food retail stores, as well as being one of the UK's biggest funeral providers. We sell a lot of things. We have a complicated supply chain, and we don't have all that much full-time resource working on impact measurement and accounting. That said, last year we had our science-based targets approved for all scopes, and this April 2020 we published our full Scope 3 footprint for the first time, broken down from field to fork to end disposal, everything, whether in scope or not, whether we've got a target for it or not, showing not just what it looks like today, but how that's changed since our 2016-17 baseline. And happily, we're seeing evidence that we've actually begun to decouple sales growth from greenhouse gas emissions. Getting to that point was a big challenge, and realistically the Scope 3 portion of that alone took us, or me with a lot of expert support, a couple of years of work. So there were a lot of things we've learned over that time, and I want to cut through all that and actually give you the helpful stuff. So I'm going to give you a really potted history and then focus a bit on Scope 3 accounting, and I think that's the bit that I think everyone struggles with. So in the Q&A, feel free to get right into any questions you'd like to probe. If I haven't covered it, just ask me, that's fine, I can mostly answer things. And we can get into the detail. So background, thank you, that slide. We are not new to this as an organisation. I'm not going to talk you through the social and cooperative history, but our first attempts at a carbon footprint are around the late 90s, early 2000s, and we reported what you'd consider a Scope 1 and 2 footprint since 2004. So that's approaching 20 years of greenhouse gas emissions targets, programmes, business change, restatements, iterations, and some modest progress in reducing Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Like for like, we're now approaching a 75% reduction in direct Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions since the start of the millennium. 20 years. And until we went through the science-based targets process and actually sat down and did a full account of our value chain, all that focus has been on step one of the problem. And that's the value of doing this. Can you go to the next slide, please? So for doing this, you can see the whole picture for the first time. All of that history, that work, those 20 years, hundreds of thousands of hours have been to reduce that light blue bit in the middle, that less than 10% of our total impact. And it's right to get your own house in order. It's right to decarbonise your own business. But we're facing a climate emergency. We need to get to grips with that huge impact that sits over here on the left, all the upstream impact, everything embedded in the products and services you sell. It is harder to deal with. It's much harder, but just look at the reward. Land use change from our ingredients is as impactful as every truck, every fridge, every boiler, every light we run in thousands of stores and funeral homes up and down the country. Ingredients 8 or 9 times the impact. And understanding this is really the first step towards solving this. So that's potted history. Top tips. First thing, it's okay that your data is crap. Everyone's data is crap. Everyone's data is crap to begin with. And to get going, you just need to understand the flow of your business well enough to understand what's big enough to care about and what isn't. And from that, you iterate. So that's step one. What's the flow of impact driving material and goods through my business? So we worked with the data we got already, and our focus was making sure that this, our fundamental unit, was as robust, as granular and trackable as possible. And for us, and probably for yourselves as well on scope 3, mostly there we're talking about tons of product. Step 2 is to ignore what doesn't matter. So okay, I've got our physical fundamental unit, I've got tons of product. I can multiply that out by sort of generic emissions factors, and I can say, actually, of my scope 3 categories, quite a few of them are immaterial for my business compared to others. Purchased goods and services is going to be massive. So fine. Step 3, we can focus down on these bigger categories and get smarter and get more detailed. Collect primary data where we can get it. Collect comparable data, so UK or for the geographies that we source from, if we can't get primary data, and then use generic emissions factors otherwise. And that last step is where we are today. Still, even as we're reporting, we are iterating on the data we've got for our most important categories, getting more primary data and breaking it down into more useful segments that we can realistically address. So what's worked well for us is trying all the way through this to make the accounting work for us and not the other way around. So as an example, our very first run of a scope 3 footprint used very generic breakdowns of where our emissions factor hotspots were throughout our chain. So we had, I think, cradle to gate, upstream transport, use phase, and end of life, which is fine for a first pass to prioritize. But actually, when you're looking at driving or accounting for any action you've taken, what's the point in having accounting that's not working for you? You just have greenhouse gas impacts, which are a sales multiplier. So over a year, we iterated on this. We built in more and more primary data, and we've now got a more useful and granular set of use phases or value chain phases that we now align our activity and reporting against. So we now report on what you can see here: land use change, ingredients, by which we mean field to farm gate, energy in manufacture, waste in manufacture, packaging of products, freight of products, energy at the co-op, transport, refrigeration, waste, and then the downstream customer journeys to store, customer food waste disposal, and customer packaging disposal. We also report a load of impacts which aren't currently in our science-based targets scope. We do not set a target around customer use of products, cooking and chilling. We don't feel like we can influence that strongly enough for that to be a valid part of our target at the moment. We don't include goods not for resale, and we don't include investments at the moment. Each of those categories take a mixture, specific data, generic data. And what I want to point out is that those impacts are really spiky. I mean, just look at that. That's our breakdown there, that footprint. Land use, pre-farm gate, biggest impact categories by far. And if you've got any land use change within your supply chain, it's going to be the same for you. That accounts for more than 70% of our total footprint. Animal agriculture, biggest driver of both land use change and field to gate impact. And that's based on direct survey or assessment with our producers or tier 1 suppliers. For the remainder, those less impactful categories, we're largely using specific product weight sold applied to more generic food product emissions factors. So maybe 100 different sets of emissions factors applied to the thousands of products that we sell. Manufacture, another 10%. For that, we use anonymously submitted category data from our suppliers. We've got a decent sample size of co-op suppliers who submit simple data onto a web platform. We apply category average figures per year for this supplier phase. Packaging, that's another 5 or 10%, and we use our existing data for packaging compliance. I could talk for ages about how we account and report and the issues and challenges with greenhouse gas protocol reporting, science-based targets, but in the interest of time, I'll just say that the main thing is to report fully and honestly. Just include everything, the good and the bad. Like, if you have uncertainties about your data, say so. If you have assumptions about your data, say so. The guidance on a lot of these things is actually still being developed. So just be clear about the assumptions that you're using and what your data actually means. Like, I'm showing you this footprint here, like the headline version. There's about 20 footnotes underneath this that explain all these different categories. So coming back to what works for us, number 1, just start, get your fundamental units sorted and build out from there. Number 2, start generic and then prioritize and get more specific. 3, use what you already have, build off the back of existing data sources or processes for your business. And 4, insight should drive action. Follow what it tells you and focus on what will actually make a difference. 5, if you've got animal agri or land use change in your scope 3, it's going to be a priority. So start early, start having those conversations. And 6, in a world of rapidly changing guidance on what and how to report and how to communicate impact, just be honest and open and spell out your assumptions. That's it from me. I'll take any questions in the Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Joe. That was fantastic. I really appreciated your candid description of how this worked for yourselves. So really, to summarize, I think one of the key points that you mentioned, which we would really echo, is just to get started. Scope 3 is scary. And as a first pass, it may not be as accurate as what you would like it to be. It won't be like your annual reports accounting, so don't treat it as such. And the standards really don't require it to be like that. A first pass to really help you understand what your likely highest impacts are and where you need to target those reductions is the most important thing. You can sort out the detail later on. It's really important to have engagement throughout this process. As Joe's infographic showed, this is not only within his remit of this job. This will involve buyers' data, this will involve procurement data, logistics. It's really important to engage everyone in your company who is likely to need you to provide data to calculate this, but also ultimately to socialize them with these topics early on, because what they have to do in their job may change as a result of the science-based target, as they will have to commit to making that element of your value chain more carbon efficient. And then really, we do encourage to align with best practice. So in terms of target setting, to really get the most benefits from this exercise, to align with 1.5 degree, and then perhaps also look to set a longer term net zero target to really lock in that leadership strategy up until 2050 to align with the British government, and to really look at what your company is doing as a part of moving the world towards 1.5 degree. So that's it from us in terms of the presentation. Looking forward to answering your questions. And as was mentioned, these questions can be directed to myself, to Joe, to Eoin, to Steve. Really do let them come in and we will do our best to answer them. For those that we don't reach, we will reply in an email. Maddie, handing it over to you.
Great, thank you, Pauline, and thank you to our presenters. We've had a lot of feedback. Thank you, Joe, for the case study. People have found it really insightful, and we've had a lot of questions coming in. So the first question that we've had is, how do you overcome the resistance from senior management of changing the measurement to include all Scope 3 aspects? So, Joe, to start with, would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on how you made the business case internally for the co-op group? Was this a demand from top down? Was this from board pressure wanting to become more sustainable, or was this from bottom up approach?
Well, bottom up actually to begin with. So I think the process we followed was a bit of a thin end of the wedge kind of process. We committed to commit is what we did to begin with. So in one of our annual reports, I think about 2.5 years ago now, we said next year we're going to commit to a leading science-based target, and that was fine. Like, the business was okay with that. We said that out to our members. Okay, that's what we're going to do. We're going to set a science-based target. That's what's required of businesses that consider themselves leaders on this. So that's how we set that out in the first instance, and then after that, once we got into the detail of what that meant, we'd sort of already primed it a little bit of say, okay, well, this is what is involved in that process. In terms of the actual sort of day-to-day of getting that target set and sort of working through the implications of that, we just had to bring in the sort of middle managers who are going to be most affected by this really early on. So for Scope 1 and 2, we had our property team, our energy buying team in there from day one, sat in the sort of kick-off meetings with ourselves and the consultants who were doing the accounting, and we've been working really closely with our agri buying team.
Great, thank you. And Pauline, if you could elaborate a little bit further, we've had a question. We could say, despite the SBTI mandating Scope 3 for this sector, how do you convince resistant clients that they have to pursue the full approach?
Yeah, so as you noted, there is sometimes a bit of resistance to calculating this. It's a complicated exercise, and in many cases, the resulting footprint and target might lead to, a complete transformation of the company strategy. So when there is that resistance, often the team members we do speak with, they think that approaching the scope 1 and 2 first is a good way to socialize the topic of science-based targets. Most companies are aware with topics of energy efficiency, procuring renewable energy. So having those initial engagements and focusing on scope 1 and 2 first and explaining what the Science-Based Targets Initiative are really does help. And taking that phased approach then allows them to digest what those targets mean and to take some stock time to reflect, okay, now the next phase is scope 3. And sometimes there is a bit of a gap in between those two pieces of work. And that's just a reflection of, in some companies, needing to kind of do a bit more onboarding before getting started with that scope 3. And as Joe mentioned, it's really important to get everyone on board before you start this exercise, to have them all there at the kickoff meeting, because it's very difficult to tell people to give you data, to tell people they have to change the way they do their job to align with this target if they're not part of the decision making initially. So my key recommendations would be to potentially, if it suits you, to start with scope 1 and 2 first, because people know it better. And then secondly, to make sure that everyone is on board with why this is important from the get-go.
Great, thank you. Our next question I'd like to ask Eoin from the SBTI. We've had a question, is it possible to set science-based targets for individual products, or does it have to be based on organizational data?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So we do require companies to set it at a corporate level. So the SBTs are defined using the greenhouse gas protocol rules. So essentially that is at a corporate level for scope 1, 2, and as we talked about for scope 3 as well. Within that, it can be very helpful for companies, particularly with uniform products, to start at a product level, conduct life cycle assessments. But ultimately, the targets must be set around the corporate structure.
Great, thank you. Hopefully that answered the question that came in.
Yeah, and I would just add to that when it comes to scope 3, that will, cover those products. So it might be, as Eoin suggested, if you have key uniform products, that aligning your scope 3 targets to a science-based trajectory will essentially be a science-based target for that product, because it's really looking at all of the upstream and downstream emissions associated with that product.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how can companies engage with their suppliers to set their own science-based targets? Are there any examples where you've seen buyers using incentives, and what kind of support can buyers give to their suppliers? So Pauline from the Carbon Trust, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, so typically when clients of ours set a supplier engagement target, they don't just drop it on all of their suppliers and say, within the next 5 years, you have to do this. Some of the types of engagements we've seen is webinars. So much like this one, they kind of help their suppliers understand what are science-based targets, how do we set them, what is required of us, and kind of hold their hand a bit on setting that journey, given that the client has set it themselves. So I think definitely that helping them on the way is really important, but equally, I guess setting a supplier engagement target is really a signal from yourself as an organization that you no longer intend to engage with suppliers who are not aligned with science. So I think it sets a really strong signal to your suppliers, as well as their competitors that you are maybe not procuring from, that you are only interested in procuring from companies that are also aligned to science. So if they perhaps are not willing to set that science-based target, it's an indication to them that they either have to align with these environmental requirements or fear losing out to yourselves, as well as some of their other customers as well, potentially. So I think, yeah, it is a clear part of a procurement strategy, but it's important to help them along the way.
Thank you. Our next question is for Joe at the Co-op. It's specifically around the work that you've done. So the question is, why or how did you choose 2016-17 as your base year rather than 2018, for example? And does this base year matter for science-based targets?
That was just a practical choice for us. So we had a long-term greenhouse gas reduction target, which was due to finish in 2020. We hit it early, so we hit it in 2016. So that's when we started the process of what we talked about, sort of saying we were going to commit to a science-based target. Happened around then, 2016-17. It runs over 2 years, or it runs for 12 months. It's a full year's data, but it runs slightly over 2016-17. Because that's the data input we had. So that's the reason. Science-based targets you can set to the baseline you choose.
Great, thank you. Our next question I'd like to ask Eoin from the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We've had a number of questions come in on the same topic, which is about how does the SBTI allow changes for targets in terms of if the size of business change? So the specific question that I'd like to ask is, what advice do you have for companies who have very ambitious future growth rates in light of setting achievable Scope 3 targets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So perhaps I can start with just addressing the question of the ability to change targets over time. So when company sets a target for the first time, of course, that target can indeed be changed over time. Companies will resubmit targets. There's a voluntary update ambition processes. So we would also always kind of advise companies that these targets are not set in stone. Many of these targets are indeed 15 years in the future. So of course, there will be many possibilities for companies to refine those over time. Indeed, when there's also changes to the business. So as I mentioned before, the SBTI criteria and guidance are based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, there is specific guidance for companies whose business is changing. For example, if there's mergers or acquisitions, or there's divestment of a particular business unit, essentially that changes the structure of the underlying inventory, and that may in fact change how representative the target is of the actual business. And in those cases, there is specific guidance within the protocol for how companies should re-baseline, how companies should redefine their targets. And we encourage companies to ensure that they are aligning to the protocol. I mean, on the specific question of growth, I mean, this is a question that we also receive a lot, and I would say it's probably one of the main challenges for companies in high growth sectors is how do they expect to set an emission reductions target when their business is in fact going to grow significantly over time. And this is kind of addressed within our Scope 3 target setting options. So there's 4 specific options that companies can choose. The first being an absolute reduction target, which is not particularly applicable for companies who are expected to grow significantly because that does require absolute reductions. But we do have 2 intensity approaches, so a physical intensity and an economic intensity approach, which allow much more flexibilities for companies in terms of absolute emissions. So the physical intensity approach will allow companies to essentially flatline their emissions and ensure that there's no growth in emissions as long as they're achieving significant intensity reductions. And we have an economic intensity approach based on the value added of the company that will also actually in principle allow slight emissions increases if significant amount of intensity reductions are occurring. But perhaps the supplier engagement option, which is our final option, is most suited for companies as well who expect to grow significantly. So rather than setting percentage reduction targets on Scope 3 emissions, the focus should actually be working with the supply chain, ensuring that the suppliers and potentially customers, business customers in particular, are actually setting their own SBTs. So that kind of engagement route is probably most applicable for these companies with high growth potential in the future.
Thanks, Eoin, a really detailed answer. Our next question I'd like to direct to Steve at the UN Global Compact Network UK. So the question is, how can signing up to the business ambition for 1.5 degree campaign that you mentioned at the beginning benefit a company who is looking to set science-based targets?
I don't want to sound, thanks, Maddie. I don't want to sound cynical in this. I think it's a practical point. in selling in to senior management the value of doing this, they're looking for a return, and we've heard, you know, many of the benefits to a business of doing this, and in part it is reputational, demonstrating ambitious commitments in this area to key stakeholders, and certainly being a part of a campaign like that gives extra value to these commitments by amplifying the leadership role that a company is taking. So I think as a means of adding to the arguments in favor of taking this step, joining into that campaign, I think gives a return on that. I would also add, I suppose, that the science is clear that we do need to get to 1.5. Therefore, and it's also equally clear that the longer we delay starting on that pathway, the more difficult it is. So I think there are a number of arguments in favor of taking that more ambitious step, and the additional reputational benefits of being a part of that campaign, I hope, would make it even easier to sell internally for practitioners that are, you know, that have that obligation to do so. Hope that answers.
Great. Thank you, Steve. We've got time for just a couple more. So our next question I'd like to ask Eoin at the SBTI. This is quite a specific question, but it may be useful for others on the webinar, is does the cost waiver for developing countries still apply for target validation at the SBTI?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah.
Great, thank you. A nice short, sweet answer. Our next question I will ask, again, Eoin, seeing as you're still unmuted, is there a belief that in time, through lobbying or other activities, that offsets will be allowable under the SBTI?
It's a great question, a controversial question, but a good one. I think a lot of this issue around offsetting will be addressed in our forthcoming work on net zero. So we are in the process of putting together guidance and criteria on, first of all, defining what is a net zero target for in the corporate sector. Secondly, how would a company achieve that, and how does that relate to science-based targets? So when we look at science-based target setting, now these are midterm targets, so between 5 and 15 years, and the focus has always been on direct emission reductions. So these targets must focus on direct emission reductions. These are not targets that can include any form of removals or sequestration. However, when we look into the future, particularly out towards 2050 and net zero, the role of offsetting, or if you want to call it carbon removal, is going to become perhaps an essential aspect to reach net zero. So we are actually in the process of defining what we would regard as valid removals and valid approaches to removing emissions, either within your value chain, in different value chains. So while I can't give you a direct answer now, I must say that a lot of these issues will be addressed in that net zero work, which is due to be published towards the end of this year by the SBTI.
That's great, thank you, Eoin. So a final question that I'd like to ask everyone, just to wrap up this webinar, and I think we'll start with Joe, if you're able to answer, is what would be your key piece of advice to attendees today within the retail and manufacturing sector who are looking to set their own targets?
Start. Just start. Like you're going to start with rubbish data. I think, as I said in that little quick overview, fundamental unit is your first thing. So make sure you know in a detailed, trackable, granular way what the ton of product moving through your business looks like. Once you've got that, you can start to build out fairly easily.
Great, thank you. And Eoin, your key piece of advice to attendees?
I mean, I would echo what Joe said. I think it's just is to start. I mean, this can often feel like a very complicated and uphill task, but I think, you know, engage with the material, look at the guidance documents. We have our tools online, which are very easy to play around with. You can download the Excel tool, you know, put in emissions data, put in target ambition, and just play around and see what would an SBT look like for your company. So I think exactly trying to demystify it and actually just make a start is by far the best approach.
Great. And Steve, the UN Global Compact Network?
Same again, to reiterate my point, we do know from the science we need to get there and we need to follow the science. So delay only makes the challenge harder. We need to get started, and I think that's the strongest argument. It only gets worse by delay.
Thanks. And finally, Pauline from the Carbon Trust, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just echo everything that everyone else has said, but if you are getting started, make sure everyone who is going to be impacted by this target is on board before you get started.
Great, thank you. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. So I'd like to hand over to Steve, who's going to do some closing remarks.
Well, just really briefly, I think frankly, this has been the best of the whole series. So it's really great to be ending on such a high point. So thank you very, very much to Eoin and Joe and Pauline for their contributions, and you, Maddie, of course. It's been a real pleasure working with Carbon Trust and all of the contributors along the way on this webinar series. All of the webinars are available, there are recordings on both the Carbon Trust and UN Global Compact Network UK websites. So do please feel free to access those and tell your friends that they're there. Really appreciate your participation today and your ambition to address the climate change problem by setting a science-based target. And we really look forward to working with you all again in the future. So thanks very much and have a great rest of the day.